No, Ashley. If a man in muddy boots and a straw hat walks through the doors of a Mercedes-Benz, he's only looking for the bathroom, not a luxury SUV. The opulent, relentless California sun beat down on the body of a mirror-polished Mercedes-Benz S-Class, creating an almost offensive halo of wealth. Right in front, expelling a puff of blue smoke, a 1978 Ford pickup truck pulled up, its red color faded by the relentless Jalisco sun. The contrast was a visual shock, a culture shock that unnerved the steely teeth of glamorous Beverly Hills. Out stepped Don Mateo Aguilar, a 60-year-old man who carried the weight of the earth in his work boots. His skin, tanned like old leather, contrasted with the immaculate white marble of the showroom. His simple yet noble palm-shaped hat seemed a direct affront to the halogen spotlights illuminating diamonds on wheels. He didn't come to admire, he came to buy. Mateo adjusted his belt buckle, an unconscious gesture that denoted a dignity imposed by daily work, not by bank checks. The smell of earth, stables, and honest labor, emanating from his clean but worn clothes, permeated the air-conditioned atmosphere of the dealership. The customers' noses, accustomed to the scent of fine leather and designer fragrances, wrinkled in an uncomfortable silence, as if a plague had crossed the threshold. Don Mateo, oblivious to the silent hostility, walked toward the receptionist. His slow but steady stride resonated like a tribal drum in the stillness of that temple of speed. He came from a world where value was measured in harvests and livestock births, and he didn't understand the veneration of these cold machines. The receptionist, a young blonde with a perfect smile named Ashley Moore, looked him up and down with a mixture of curiosity, disdain, and obvious annoyance. His mind, accustomed to dealing with CEOs and Hollywood celebrities, struggled to categorize this man, this fossil from another era. Her voice, sweet and gruff at the same time, rose to a distinctly condescending tone. "How may I help you, sir? Are you looking for the maintenance desk or perhaps the chauffeur's waiting room?" The subtle insult of suggesting he couldn't be a customer echoed in Mateo's ears. But he, a man who had dealt with droughts and pests, wasn't bothered by such simple disrespect. From his elegant glass-fronted office, the manager, Brandon Cole, wearing an Italian suit and silk tie, observed the scene. His first impulse was to call security. This man didn't belong there, and his presence, Brandon thought elitistly, devalued the brand's exclusive atmosphere. Brandon stood lazily, his impeccable figure crossing the room with the cadence of someone who knows each step costs thousands of dollars. The customers, most of them waiting for the formalities of their latest automotive whim, interrupted their conversations and turned their attention to the farmer, an exotic specimen of opulence. The air was thick with the judgment of the upper class, a silent judgment, but more biting than any shout. Don Mateo waited for the manager's arrival, Brandon's steady gaze fixed on his cynical one. He wasn't there to beg. He was there to execute a transaction that, for him, transcended economics. His hand touched the inside pocket of his jacket, feeling the texture of a folded piece of paper, a document that represented the fruit of years of tireless work and a promise made on the brink of desperation. At that moment, in that marble and steel room, the world of ostentation and the world of true need collided head-on, and the spark was about to ignite a confrontation. Mateo's daughter, Lucía Valeria, had been the architect of this meeting, although he was the only one who knew it. Brandon finally stopped in front of Mateo, his smile strained and forced, but his cold eyes weren't able to meet his gaze. "Sir, this is an exclusive dealership. Our vehicles have considerable prices." The implication was clear. He doesn't have the money. Mateo, without raising his voice, responded in slow, measured, ranch-accented Spanish. "I know, young man, I'm not a man to waste time. I'm here to talk business. Big business. I want to buy." His statement, so simple and direct, hung in the air, met only with skepticism. The word buy in this man's mouth sounded like a badly told joke. Brandon Cole blinked slowly, processing the absurd figure the man was reading. His mind, trained in the arithmetic of greed, made a quick calculation. 15 trucks was a monstrous commission, but the image of the customer didn't match the amount. A vein in his temple began to throb with irritation. He thought the old man was joking, or worse, that he'd come to the wrong store, perhaps looking for the used dealership on the other side of town. The dream of a big sale battled with the reality of a man in dirt boots. Ashley Moore, with her seasoned saleswoman cynicism, couldn't help but laugh, covering her mouth with a hand adorned with manicure perfect. It was a laugh laced with prejudice, a laugh that said, "Look at this poor man thinking he can play in our league." Brandon, picking up on the signal, let his disbelief turn into open mockery. He leaned slightly toward Mateo, lowering his voice to a sarcastic whisper that, because of its clarity, resonated throughout the room. 15 trucks? Really, Mr. Aguilar? That's asking a lot. The tension was already palpable, but it was Ashley's comment, delivered from her position with unconscious malice, that broke the formality. Trying to be humorous with an arrogant customer standing nearby, she uttered the phrase that would go down in the dealership's history. "And you'll pay with cow's milk?" The remark, spoken in a mocking tone, provoked widespread laughter. The customers on the leather sofas, the salesman next door, even the cleaning man, everyone joined in the mockery. The humiliation was public, brutal, and focused on Don Mateo's apparent poverty. Don Mateo's face, which until that moment had been a mask of stoicism, merely contorted. It wasn't a gesture of anger, but of deep, piercing pain. Cow's milk was his life's sustenance, the symbol of his ranch's hard work, the purity of the land he loved. Hearing it used as a joke, as the most ridiculous bargaining chip, was a direct blow to his dignity. The laughter echoed off the marble walls, reflecting the arrogance of a world that only respected the plastic of a credit card. Mateo didn't respond to the mockery with words. Instead, he clenched his fist, a gesture of restraint that demonstrated his inner strength. He remembered his wife's words, now a silent promise. "Patience is the armor of the righteous, Mateo." He had come prepared for doubt, perhaps for distrust, but not for this level of open contempt. The deal was no longer just business. It had become a test of character, a silent battle between humility and arrogance. Brandon, sensing that the situation was getting out of hand and that the spectacle had already gone on too long, tried to regain a false professionalism. "Sir, please, with all due respect, this isn't a farm. If you don't have an approved letter of credit—" Mateo's interruption was a whiplash. "I have more than a letter of credit, young man. I have years of honest work. And I have a purpose." His voice, despite its country accent, carried an authority that silenced the few still laughing. It was the voice of a man who had managed hundreds of workers and who knew the true value of his possessions. But the damage was done. Ashley avoided Mateo's gaze, feeling a slight pang of guilt, but the arrogance was stronger. The salon's elite watched him like a circus animal, waiting for the next trick. The customer who laughed the hardest, a man with a flashy watch, whispered to his companion, "He must have escaped from a film set." The public humiliation had washed over him, searing the offense into the heart of a man who didn't deserve it. Don Mateo felt a fever rising in him, not from shame, but from a determination that hardened to steel. If these young men were going to judge him on his own merits, they would have to endure the humiliation of his mistake. He had come to make the purchase of a lifetime, driven by a promise that weighed more than all the gold in Beverly Hills. Their contempt only fueled his mission. The silence that followed Mateo's declaration, "I want 15 heavy-duty Mercedes-Benz pickup trucks," was thick, suffocating the luxurious atmosphere. Brandon Cole and Ashley Moore's disbelief turned to mockery, and the manager finally let out a dry, humorless laugh. It was a piercing sound, echoing off the marble walls like a ridiculous phrase. Brandon shook his head in disbelief. He'd dealt with eccentrics before, but this farmer was taking mockery to a stratospheric level, and he wasn't going to allow his dealership to become a stage for comedy. He tried, one last time, to dismiss Mateo with a false air of compassion. "Mr. Aguilar," Brandon managed to say between laughs, "I appreciate your time, but this is a high-end store. I suggest you find a middleman or schedule an appointment. A tour of our museum, when it's open to the public, of course." The implication was clear. He didn't even deserve to be a potential client. Mateo, however, showed no intention of budging. His eyes, which had seen the sun rise 1,000 times over the agave fields, fixed Brandon with an unwavering determination. He wasn't there to be polite. He was there to close a deal that, to him, was sacred. The wealthy spectators, seated in Italian leather armchairs, began to whisper and laugh out loud. To them, it was the entertainment of the day, a scene from a poorly made movie where a peasant defied the system. A socialite with perfectly coiffed hair pulled out her cell phone, not to call the police, but to record the comedy, thinking it would make a good story for herself. Lunch the next morning. The humiliation that had weighed on Mateo was now a public display, fueled by the arrogance of the Beverly Hills elite, who felt superior. Mateo felt the force of the collective contempt, but instead of flinching, he pulled a set of heavy wrenches from his pants pocket. They were keys to tractors, sheds, and his own battered pickup truck, and slammed them onto the ebony counter. The clang of metal against wood was alarming and silenced the room for a moment. It was the embodiment of his work, the literal weight of his life. "I'm not kidding," he declared, and his voice, though low, carried the authority of one who runs the country. "The 15 trucks are for my fleet. I need them in 60 days, and I'll pay in cash." The word cash was a second shock. It was an amount that exceeded the quarterly profits of many of the small businesses owned by some of the clients present. Some people's laughter died away, giving way to a twinge of uncertainty. Brandon, who was about to pick up the phone to call security, froze. A request of such magnitude, however unlikely, required a degree of caution. His commission, if true, would be the largest of his career. He tried to regain his composure, but the fear of losing a fortune overrode his prejudices. Ashley, the saleswoman who had suggested paying with cow's milk, paled. The joke was boomeranging back on her, damaging her own credibility. She leaned toward Brandon and hurriedly whispered, "Brandon, what if it's a drug trafficker? They always use cash and buy large items to launder them. We have to call the police." The saleswoman's mind raced from one prejudice to another, unable to accept the simple truth that a man dressed like that could be a legitimate businessman, an agricultural magnate. Mateo noticed their looks of fear and suspicion. "I'm not what you think," he said aloud, correcting Ashley's murmur. "I'm a farmer, a grain and dairy producer from Los Altos, Jalisco. My money comes from the land, from the work of thousands of hands. It's clean, honest, and it's in an American bank." The firmness in his voice now wasn't threatening, but rather deeply assertive, forcing them to confront the hypocrisy of their judgment. The marble and glass hall became a silent courtroom. The audience, who had previously laughed openly, now watched Mateo with a mixture of fascination and embarrassment. They were witnessing the fall of a stereotype. Mateo's once comical figure took on epic proportions. He was neither a beggar nor a bandit. He was a powerful man, whose simple clothing was a testament to his authenticity. Brandon finally took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation. "Okay, Mr. Aguilar. If you are who you say you are, we need proof of funds, account statements, etc. Irrevocable letter of credit issued by a prestigious bank." He was still skeptical, but the possibility of closing the deal forced him to act professionally. He wouldn't ask him to leave anymore. He would ask for documents. Mateo smiled sadly. He hadn't come to prove himself to them. He had come to close a deal and tell them a story. He looked at Brandon, then at Ashley, and with a slow gesture he picked up his hat and placed it firmly in his lap. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of rushing or submitting. He would sit down, and they would have to wait. Mateo moved with the deliberate calm of someone in control of his own time, not the other way around. Instead of opening the folder of documents he carried or seeking out a bank manager to prove his worth, he simply sat on the edge of a white leather armchair near the reception desk. His palm-shaped hat rested in his lap, a symbol of his humble origins in stark contrast to the opulent upholstery. His act was a silent defiance. He would no longer challenge his credibility. He would simply wait for the dealership's owner, Fernando Alvarez. Brandon Cole, puzzled by the act of passive defiance, waved his hands in confusion. "Mr. Aguilar, this isn't a lobby, a hotel. You can't stay here waiting for Mr. Alvarez. He has a tight schedule, important meetings. He can't be interrupted by a... He choked, unable to find a word that wasn't openly offensive. Brandon's desperation was growing. He couldn't close the sale, and he couldn't get rid of the farmer who was ruining the atmosphere. Mateo didn't respond, but the silence was a louder answer than any shout. He crossed his ankles. The worn leather of his work boots contrasted sharply with the immaculate marble floor. His eyes scanned the room, but not with envy or admiration. He calculated the true value of all that luxury, comparing it to the cost of a life, a surgery, an unattainable dream. His patience wasn't a lack of haste. It was a tactic, a powerful weapon that humbled the impatience and superficiality of those present. Mateo's attitude attracted more attention than the previous commotion. People were used to seeing explosive conflicts or immediate submission, but this serene stubbornness was disconcerting. His stillness seemed to shout a question to everyone present. "What makes you run so fast?" The atmosphere of the dealership, usually frenetic due to haste and ostentation, was forced to moderate to the slow, measured pace of the rest of the group. Ashley tried the forced niceness strategy. She brought him a glass of mineral water. "Premium, would you like to have a coffee? Or take a look at the file from the truck line while you wait?" She was visibly nervous, trying to dismiss the cow's milk insult with obsequiousness. Mateo accepted the water with a polite gesture and declined the coffee and file. He wasn't there to consume what was offered to him, nor to be entertained. He was there to wait for the only man he would ever do business with. The wait stretched into the morning. Several customers came and went, all staring at the farmer sitting in the armchair. He was reading a small, worn-cover book he'd taken from his shirt pocket, a collection of poems. The image of the wealthy farmer reading poetry in the Mercedes-Benz lobby was so inappropriate that it transformed the showroom into a conceptual art gallery. The spectacle of waiting became more fascinating than the fleet of vehicles itself. Brandon, feeling helpless and embarrassed, called Fernando Alvarez, the owner. His voice cracked with frustration as he tried to explain the situation. "Sir, we have a man sitting here. He claims to be an important client from Mexico. I insulted him. I mean us. We insulted him, and now he refuses to leave until he speaks with you." Brandon feared losing his commission and being fired. But even more so, he feared his boss's wrath over a loss of millions. Mateo heard Lucía Valeria's name echo in his mind. He didn't care how exhausting the wait was. The promise he'd made was far greater than any discomfort or humiliation he could endure in one day. Lucía was looking forward to her surgery, and his was the longest and most painful wait of all. His own wait was a silent tribute to his daughter's resilience. Time passed slowly, measured only by glances of contempt and curiosity. The fact that Mateo, the man who had been ridiculed, now commanded the room's attention with such passivity and dignity was his small revenge. His patience wasn't inertia, it was power. Mateo's forced tranquility was dramatically shattered by the thunderous entrance of Marjorie Whitman, 50, wife of an influential California congressman and a prominent figure in Beverly Hills high society. She walked into the dealership convinced that the world revolved around her needs. With her designer sunglasses and a handbag that cost more than Mateo's truck, she embodied the most superficial face of the elite. She was there to pick up her new, passenger car, and I didn't expect such an unpleasant visual obstacle. Marjorie stopped abruptly when she saw Mateo sitting on the couch. Her expression twisted in disgust. "Brandon!" she cried in a high-pitched, indignant voice. "What is this? Why is there a salon from customers? Has this store become a refuge? I thought Mercedes' standards were a little higher than those of the subway station." Marjorie's offense was crude, public, and specific, intensifying the humiliation Mateo had been suffering. Brandon rushed over, desperately trying to appease his most influential client. He whispered, trying to justify Mateo's presence as a high-volume prospect, but Marjorie didn't hear him. She was disgusted by the bursting of her bubble of exclusivity. "I don't care who he is, Brandon. Look at him. He's wearing dirty boots, reading a book. Your real clients don't read poetry at the front desk, Brandon. They write checks. Tell him to leave. Immediately. He's degrading the environment." Marjorie's words were like a whiplash, not only for Mateo, but also for saleswoman Ashley and manager Brandon, who felt compelled to obey. Collective contempt grew under the socialite's leadership. All eyes focused on Mateo, waiting for him to stand up in embarrassment and flee. The scene had become a hunt, and Mateo was the prey. The atmosphere, already tense, turned palpably hostile. Mateo slowly closed his book, placing it on his hat. He looked up at Marjorie. There was no hatred in his gaze, only a deep sadness for the woman's emptiness. She had weathered storms in the countryside. She would not be intimidated by the storm of futility. But the humiliation at that moment was the hardest to bear, for it tarnished not only her image, but also the memory of the reason for his visit. The security guards, alerted by the commotion, began to approach discreetly, their footsteps muffled by the marble. The threat of a forced eviction hung in the air. Mateo's dignity hung in the balance, and the elite waited, like a theater audience, for the final expulsion. Brandon was on the verge of collapse, watching his career crumble as he tried to balance the greed of $1 million commission with the demands of a politically influential socialite. Amidst the chaos, Mateo's simple figure increasingly became a symbol of resistance. He represented honesty, hard work, and country life, in direct opposition to the superficiality and instant judgment of city life. His presence was an uncomfortable mirror for the empty souls of those who valued only what they could see and touch. Marjorie, feeling victorious, grabbed her car keys and gave Mateo one last look of contempt. "I hope when I get back to look for my car, this one's gone." Nonsense. It's been deleted. It confirmed the collective judgment. He was an intruder, a nuisance that threatened the purity of their luxurious world. The pressure for Brandon to act was unbearable. The two bodyguards, burly, silent men, advanced firmly toward Don Mateo. The atmosphere became dense, charged with the anticipation of an imminent physical confrontation. Marjorie Whitman watched the scene with cool satisfaction, as if her demands were about to be met, restoring order to her sumptuous temple. Brandon and Ashley watched, paralyzed by the fear of a fight in the showroom, which would undoubtedly end their careers. The tension was so thick you could cut the atmosphere of shame and hostility with a knife, and everyone expected Mateo to finally cave in and run away. Mateo, however, didn't move a muscle. He didn't look at the security guards or Marjorie. Instead, his gaze wandered for a moment, fixed on an invisible spot on the polished marble, and sank into a painful memory. He saw himself back at the ranch, not in the Mercedes in Beverly Hills. He saw himself hugging his daughter, Lucía Valeria, on a cold night on the porch, while she held a teddy bear with large, sad eyes. The image of the 8-year-old girl, fragile and full of dreams, invaded his mind with scorching clarity. He heard her voice, small but filled with a childlike wisdom that had disarmed him at that moment. "Dad, why are people mean to people who don't have nice clothes?" Her question, posed after a visit to the local hospital, where he'd been mistreated by an orderly because of his simple attire, reflected the pain he felt now. That childish question, posed years ago, was the key to his resilience. He couldn't give in to humiliation, for that would mean betraying the lesson of dignity he'd tried to teach his daughter. The weight of humiliation, in that moment, didn't fall on his money or his clothes. It fell on the memory of Lucía, on the oath he'd made that kindness and purpose prevailed over superficial judgment. He felt a pang in his chest, sharper than the pain of any insult. His only fear was that her contempt would make him lose focus, that it would lead him to abandon the mission that had brought him to that hostile place, the dream he'd sworn to build. The security guards stood a few feet away, their imposing silhouettes looming over the chair. One of them extended his hand, the initial gesture of inviting or forcing him to stand. The entire room held its breath. It was clear to everyone that this humble man had no intention of giving in to intimidation. His calmness was a challenge, and the silence of his suffering subtly moved the hearts of the spectators. Marjorie, impatient with the security guard's slowness, stamped her foot. "Quick! Get him out of here! He's making me nervous!" Her irritation was the last flame of arrogance that needed extinguishing. The security guards hesitated, noting the man's unusual dignity. They were used to dealing with customers drunk or sellers undisciplined. But I don't like that kind of silent stoicism. Mateo knew he needed to endure the situation for a moment longer, until the owner arrived or something broke through the wall of prejudice. He took a deep breath and exhaled a sigh that seemed to carry the air of the Jalisco ranch. He wasn't a criminal. He was a grieving father, moved by a love that transcended death and greed. The audience, at last, began to perceive something more. The fate of the confrontation hung in the balance. The security guards were about to grab Don Mateo when the dealership's front door opened again and a new customer walked in. This wasn't just any customer. It was Dr. Hector Ramirez, a middle-aged Mexican-American businessman, impeccably dressed but with tanned skin and warm eyes, an agribusiness magnate who had made his fortune legally in the U.S. market but maintained deep roots in Mexico. Hector Ramirez, oblivious to the tension in the showroom, he approached the front desk to pick up the documents for his new truck. However, his gaze immediately fell on the figure of the farmer under pressure and the pile of papers Brandon had dropped on the counter. He recognized the bank logo and the origin of the documents. With the keen instinct of a businessman, he intervened before the security guards could touch Mateo. "Just a moment, gentlemen," Dr. Ramirez said in a firm, polite voice, with unquestionable authority. He addressed Brandon, pointing at the scattered documents. "May I see these papers? I'm curious. I believe they are documents from the Aguilar Agriculture Company." The name, laden with prestige in the industry, made Brandon take a step back, terrified. It was too important to ignore. Hector Ramirez took the folder, quickly flipping through the bank statements and land ownership documents with an air of familiarity. He frowned for a moment, then raised his head and looked around the room full of clients and employees who were watching him in deathly silence. His gaze fell on Don Mateo, and a smile of recognition, sincere and respectful, spread across his face. He gave a slight bow in deference. "Excuse me," Hector said, speaking loudly and clearly, in perfect English fit for the Beverly Hills elite. "I know these documents, and I know this man." He turned to Brandon and then to Marjorie, his mouth agape in surprise. "This man is not homeless, nor a nuisance. This man is Don Mateo Aguilar. He is one of the largest and most respected grain and dairy producers in Los Altos de Jalisco and all of Mexico." The revelation fell like a thunderclap. The name Aguilar resonated with the solidity of decades of fortune and hard work. The man they were about to oust was worth far more in land and produce than most of the customers present. Brandon and Ashley paled, and Marjorie Whitman's once haughty face twisted in shame. Her privilege crumbled in the face of the truth. Hector continued, emphasizing the irony of the situation. "Mr. Aguilar is the primary supplier of ingredients to half of the food companies you visit in the United States. The money he uses is cleaner and more solid than any stock market bond." The silence that followed was no longer one of tension, but one of shame and overwhelming guilt. The security guard who was about to touch Mateo stepped back, putting his hands behind his back. The other customers looked away, feeling complicit in the humiliation. Mateo, who hadn't said anything, simply nodded to Hector, a silent gesture of thanks, but one that sealed the alliance between the two successful men who knew where they were coming from. The awkward silence that followed Dr. Hector Ramirez's revelation was broken by Brandon and Ashley's desperate rush toward Mateo. The fear of losing the biggest job of their lives and the terror of facing the owner's wrath transformed their mockery into sudden, forced servitude. Ashley, her voice now thick with false empathy, tried to push a glass of expensive champagne toward Mateo. "Mr. Aguilar, forgive me. I had no idea what you said. Cow's milk. I was just joking. I apologize." "We want to start the paperwork for the 15 trucks immediately." Brandon, visibly sweating under his Italian suit, tried to overpower the saleswoman. He extended his hand to Mateo, but the farmer didn't shake it. "Mr. Aguilar, I feel indescribably ashamed. You are a pillar of the economy. I was foolish, arrogant. Please allow us to take you to our luxurious office. We can close this deal in 10 minutes. Whatever you need, a discount, a gift, the fleet will be yours today." The haste and greed behind their apologies were as transparent as the dealership's glass walls. They weren't sorry for the offense, but for the financial loss it nearly caused them. Mateo, still sitting in the armchair, looked at them both. His eyes conveyed a silent judgment more powerful than any reprimand. He didn't stand up, accept the champagne, or shake Brandon's hand. His dignity was intact. Finally he spoke, and his voice was low, forcing everyone to lean in to listen. A new form of power over the room. "No, young man, you're not going to start the paperwork now. I'm not convinced by discounts or royalties." His refusal to accept an easy redemption paralyzed them. Socialite Marjorie Whitman, who had retreated to a corner, was red-faced with anger and humiliation, but remained silent. Dr. Ramirez, for his part, watched the scene with admiration, knowing that Mateo was about to teach them an unforgettable lesson. The rancher wasn't there just to buy trucks. He was there to buy the public, a platform for his true mission, and he wouldn't accept anything less. Mateo ignored Brandon and Ashley and turned to Dr. Ramirez, the only one who had treated him with respect. "Thank you, Hector. You know, money has never been the most important thing to me." Then he turned his gaze to the anxious faces of the sales team. "I'm not here for the money. Money is just the means. I'm here for a promise." The word promise hung in the air, thick and full of meaning. Ashley sobbed, a mixture of fear and confusion. "A promise? What promise, sir?" Mateo was silent for a moment, savoring the reversal of roles. They, who had been mocking each other, were now pleading for answers. He still wouldn't tell them the whole truth. He needed their pain to be real for their redemption to be genuine. "A promise I made to a very important person," he replied, his voice cracking with suppressed emotion, but firm. "And that promise is worth more than all these trucks combined. The deal will only be closed when the owner of this dealership, Mr. Fernando Alvarez, hears the full story." He forced them to wait for his boss and the story, prolonging the mystery. Dr. Ramirez, understanding Mateo's game, intervened. "I'm serious. It's an oath of honor, and anyone who knows Don Mateo knows his word is worth more than all his gold." The assurance of a third party increased Brandon's anxiety, knowing that his job depended on Fernando's immediate arrival. Brandon's car alarm, which he had accidentally set off out of nervousness, was the only sound to break the silence until a black luxury sedan pulled into the main entrance, skidding slightly. The doors opened and Fernando Alvarez, the dealership owner, jumped to his feet, his face contorted with fury and concern. Brandon had informed him of an angry VIP client and a PR disaster, and he rushed to try and remedy the situation. Fernando, a man in his early 40s with an air of unquestionable but not cruel power, quickly surveyed the scene. The silent farmer in his armchair, Brandon pale and sweaty, Ashley with tears forced in her eyes, and Dr. Hector Ramirez, one of his most prestigious clients, observing everything. He knew immediately that his team's mistake had been colossal. His first action was professional and decisive. He approached Brandon and Ashley. "Both of you, to my office, now. You're suspended until I understand the extent of the damage you've caused, and apologize sincerely, not to my commission, but to this man's dignity." Fernando's severe and public rebuke shocked everyone. Fernando then addressed Don Mateo with a deference that came from his heart. He bowed slightly. "Mr. Aguilar, my name is Fernando Alvarez, and I am the owner of this dealership. I am deeply ashamed of the treatment you received. There is no excuse for the arrogance and prejudices of my staff. Please accept my most sincere apologies." His voice was firm, and he bore responsibility for the mistake. Mateo finally stood up, accepting Fernando's gesture of respect, but keeping his distance. "Your apology is the first sincere one I've heard this morning, Mr. Alvarez. I appreciate it. But, as I told your employees, I'm not here to give myself a discount or humiliate you. I'm here to keep a promise that can't wait." The room was completely silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Even Marjorie, the socialite, had fallen silent, fascinated by Mateo's moral authority. Fernando knew he was facing a situation that transcended business. He could no longer treat Mateo like a client. He needed to treat him like a man of honor with a story to tell. "I'll listen to you, Mr. Aguilar," Fernando replied, pointing to a more private area. "Whatever you need, but I want to understand. How much is this promise, 15 trucks and your ride here worth? Sit with me, please, and tell me." He didn't offer a customer seat, but his own. Mateo looked at Dr. Ramirez, who nodded approvingly. The moment had come. He had waited for the right person and the right moment. Humiliation was overcome by deference, and now the stage was set for the truth that would resonate with everyone present. He no longer needed to talk about money. He needed to talk about heart. Mateo and Fernando sat in a more private corner of the showroom. The manager, although suspended, and the saleswoman, although panicked, watched from afar, along with the customers and Dr. Ramirez. Attention had shifted from the luxury cars to the unassuming man who dominated the room. Mateo's voice, as he began to speak, was low and shaky at first, weighed down by years of pain. He was no longer in negotiating mode. He was in father mode. "I'm a lucky man, Mr. Alvarez," he began. "My land has given me everything money can buy. But 3 years ago, my life changed and money became empty." He paused, taking a deep breath to control his emotion. "I had a daughter. Her name was Lucía Valeria." The name, laden with tenderness and pain, was the first arrow shot into the audience's hearts. The mention of a sick child silenced even the most superficial thoughts. She continued, her voice, though low, taking on a serene strength as she told him about the little girl. Lucía was a light, intelligent, curious, and with a big heart. From a very young age, she dreamed of being a doctor. Not a rich doctor for the elite, but a doctor for the poor and sick children of Jalisco, those who didn't have the money to wait. The image of the dreamy little girl clashed with the image of the rich people who, moments before, had mocked her father. Mateo described Lucía's life, the games in the fields, the simple joy, and the day she was diagnosed with a serious illness, like a brutal blow of fate. The audience at the dealership, who had been laughing a moment before, now felt a pang of terror and empathy. They were parents, or had children. And Mateo's pain was universal, transcending barriers of language and social class. She spoke of the months of going back and forth between hospitals, the bureaucracy, and the agonizing wait for a surgery that could have saved her life. We saw the hope fade from her eyes. She wasn't complaining about the pain, but about the injustice. "Dad," she would say to me, "can't we do something so other children don't have to wait so long?" The girl's quote, simple and poignant, was proof that Mateo's mission was born of pure compassion. Fernando Alvarez listened, his head bowed, ashamed and deeply moved. He had children, and the story had a powerful impact on him. He realized that the man before him wasn't a client, but a messenger of tragedy and altruism. Dr. Ramirez, standing nearby, had teary eyes, as did Brandon and Ashley, who watched the scene from afar. Mateo concluded the prelude with a broken voice. Lucía Valeria left us 3 years ago, but not before extracting a promise from me. Mateo paused, his gaze fixed on Fernando. But his mind was fixed on his daughters last night. That moment, at the edge of a cold, impersonal hospital bed, was the most sacred of his life. He described the scene with painful clarity. Lucía, pale and small, clinging to his hand with surprising strength, knowing that the next day's surgery was her only chance, and perhaps her farewell. That modest hospital room contrasted starkly with the opulent marble living room where she lay, and the difference heightened the drama. That night, before they took her away, she didn't ask me to buy her a new doll. She didn't ask me to take her to an amusement park, Mateo said, his voice now hoarse, amplified by emotion. She made me promise that if she didn't come back, I wouldn't let her dream die. She made me swear, right there in front of God and my wife, that I would use all my money to build a hospital for poor children. The revelation of the promise struck everyone present with overwhelming force. The silence in the dealership was almost physical. The sound of bated breath could be heard. The mere mention of the child's death and the urgency of the last wish transformed the business atmosphere into a dignified wake. Brandon, Ashley, and even Marjorie Whitman, who had returned to spy, were now openly weeping. Contempt and greed had been replaced by collective mourning and the shame of superficiality. Mateo let his tears fall freely, indifferent to the image of weakness. That was the strongest moment of his life. He wasn't weak, but a grieving father. She didn't make it, Mr. Alvarez. The surgery didn't work. The bureaucracy, the lack of beds, and the waiting. They stole Lucia's time. He touched his hat in his lap, an automatic gesture of a man clinging to his faith. Lucia's dream, he explained, wasn't about sophisticated machines, but about time and access for those who needed it most. Fernando Alvarez stood up, unable to contain himself any longer. He approached Mateo and, in a gesture unthinkable for an elite magnate, placed his hand on the farmer's shoulder, a sign of silent solidarity. He felt the pain of loss and the magnitude of honor. He saw that the man before him was not a client, but a hero in mourning, carrying the weight of a legacy of unconditional love. Marjorie, the socialite, tears streaming down her expensive makeup, finally understood the meaning of the phrase, "Character doesn't dress up." The man she had dismissed as a nuisance wasn't there for himself, but for the memory of his daughter and the salvation of hundreds of children he would never see. The humiliation she had inflicted on him returned to her with the force of a moral judgment. Fernando Alvarez, calm but visibly shaken, looked at Mateo and stammered, "I'm so sorry, Don Mateo. I'm so sorry for your loss and the suffering our team has caused you. But please tell me, why 15 trucks? Why this amount? And why now?" Fernando's question was the final piece of the puzzle, the bridge between personal tragedy and business transaction. Mateo wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He glanced at Fernando and then scanned the room, his gaze including Brandon, Ashley, Dr. Ramirez, and even Marjorie. It was time to tie up loose ends, to give tangible meaning to his pain and his money. 15, he said in a loud, resonant voice, is not a business number, Mr. Alvarez. It's a pain number. She bowed slightly, confiding the secret of her request to everyone. Lucia's life, like that of so many poor children, depended on the waiting list at the public hospital. She was entitled to surgery, but due to a lack of resources and beds, she had to wait. She waited for 15 long and cruel months. The revelation shocked everyone. Bureaucracy and inequality were the true villains of the story, and the number 15 was the symbol of the system's failure. Every truck I buy here represents one of those months of waiting that were taken away from me, Mateo explained. I don't need them to transport grain. I need them to start a transportation company, interstate here in the United States. I will operate this fleet day and night, and all the profit, every penny, will be used for one purpose: to expand the Lucía Valeria Children's Hospital in Guadalajara. The silence in the room was reverent. The multi-million-dollar purchase wasn't a whim or an ostentation. It was a lifelong project, a mission of revenge against time and the inequality that had robbed her of her daughter. The hospital would be the negation of that cruel weight, a place where no child would be sent home for lack of money or a bed. Mateo finished with a calm and challenging look at Fernando. The deal, Mr. Alvarez, will be closed today. I'll take them. But now you know that this transaction isn't about Mercedes-Benz. It's about a father keeping a sacred promise. It's about transforming pain into salvation. The emotional impact turned into a wave of solidarity. Fernando Alvarez, ashamed and inspired, didn't hesitate. He approached Mateo, but no longer as a businessman. "Don Mateo," he said, his voice breaking. "Mercedes-Benz isn't just going to sell these trucks. We want to be your official partners in this legacy." Fernando continued, giving way to emotion and business acumen. "There will be no profit for us. I'm waiving any margin from the sale of the 15 trucks, turning this into a full sponsorship of Mercedes-Benz for your cause. In addition, my company will provide fleet maintenance, fuel, and technical support free of charge for the first 3 years." The owner's gesture wasn't just charity, it was corporate redemption, a recognition that dignity is worth more than money. The redemption, however, didn't stop with the owner. Brandon Cole and Ashley Moore, watching from afar, tentatively approached. Brandon, his brow furrowed in the sincere apology he finally managed to express, spoke first. "Mr. Aguilar, we don't deserve your forgiveness, but we want to do the right thing. Ashley and we waive our entire commission from this sale. The money should go directly to the hospital's first deposit. It's the least we can do to honor Lucía Valeria's memory." The couple, once the epitome of arrogance, now offered their financial gain as penance. And the final and most surprising twist came from Marjorie Whitman, the socialite. She approached hesitantly. Her eyes, once filled with contempt, were now filled with tears and guilt. She extended her hand to Mateo, not to make deals, but in a silent plea for forgiveness. "Don Mateo, my husband is a congressman. I have influence. I can help. Expedite building permits in Mexico and secure political support for your hospital infrastructure. Please allow me to use my voice for something that really matters. Excuse me for mocking your heart." The marble hall, the scene of humiliation, became the cradle of an unlikely alliance. The humble farmer had exposed the empty soul of the elite, but in doing so, he had offered them a path to redemption. Contempt became alliance, and the business transaction became a transnational social project. The 15 trucks were no longer just vehicles, but the fleet of hope, propelled by a father's grief and the sudden generosity of previously cold hearts. Months passed, and Don Mateo's promise materialized with inspiring speed. The 15 trucks, now operational and sponsored by Mercedes-Benz, roared down the highways between Mexico and the United States. Money, previously stashed in bank accounts, flowed tirelessly to Guadalajara, transformed into bricks, steel, and cutting-edge medical equipment. Lucía Valeria Children's Hospital grew rapidly. The girl's name, painted in capital letters on the facade, a beacon of hope. The alliance forged under the shadow of humiliation proved solid. Fernando Alvarez ensured the transport fleet thrived, maximizing the construction profits. Brandon and Ashley, returning to their socially responsible roles, organized fundraising events, telling Lucía Valeria's story to garner more donations. They had found a purpose their salaries could never achieve. Marjorie Whitman, keeping her promise, used her political connections to expedite construction in Mexico, ensuring the hospital's completion in record time. The socialite who hated dirt was now involved in public health campaigns, rediscovering the value of her influence outside the red carpet. What began as mockery became a chain of hope and social activism. On opening day, the Lucía Valeria Children's Hospital opened its doors, a modern, clean, and, above all, free space for the neediest children in Jalisco. The hospital had 15 beds, one for each month Lucía was pregnant. The first surgeries, performed in the following weeks, saved the lives of dozens of children, offering them the time and attention Lucía couldn't receive. Pain had given life. Mateo stood at the door, dressed in his usual simple clothes, but surrounded by the admiration and respect of everyone. He saw some poor parents, just as anxious as he, enter, certain that their children would be cared for. He saw how the injustice that had devastated him was undone by an act of unconditional love. Mateo Aguilar stared at the polished bronze photo at the entrance to Lucía Valeria Hospital. Lucía, 8 years old and with a smile that dazzled the world, was there. The 15 trucks, now an organic fleet of the foundation, roared through the streets, each carrying the voice of a fulfilled promise. The Marble Hall in Beverly Hills seemed like a distant dream, a bitter memory that time had healed with the balm of action. Brandon Cole, now the hospital's volunteer director of public relations in California, stood beside her, dressed in a suit, but with eyes full of a humanity that luxury could never have taught him. Mateo's voice, firm but gentle, broke the silence of contemplation. He didn't speak to Brandon. He spoke to the image of his daughter, to the legacy she had left behind. "Dad, we did it. The wait is over for everyone." Yes, they did. The pain of one loss had become the relief of hundreds. That place wasn't built with bricks and mortar, but with restored dignity, accepted apologies, and a profound recognition that a man's character isn't worn, it's carried. It wasn't in his hat, nor in his hiking boots, but in the unwavering strength of his word and the purity of his mission. Mateo stepped back and watched the movement. He saw Marjorie Whitman, now a volunteer mentor to a farming family. He saw Fernando Alvarez, the entrepreneur, hugging one of the doctors. He saw the prejudices of that day dispelled by the usefulness of this new life. What he had contributed to Mercedes-Benz was more than money. It was a humanity class that transformed the lives of all those who mocked him, proving that true power lies not in what one possesses, but in the depth of one's honor and purpose. He smiled, the smile of a father who finally buried his daughter's soul, fulfilling her last wish to make a difference. The legacy of Lucía Valeria, the girl who dreamed of being a doctor, was the hospital, the place where the wait for medical care ended. The moral of the story resonated in the hearts of all who heard it. Character isn't dressed, it's worn. This is the power of a promise, the lesson of Don Mateo. You saw how cruelty and contempt can be transformed into a stream of hope and redemption. Don Mateo's story teaches us that no matter how small or judged you feel, your mission and your character are your true legacy. Criticism is temporary, but your dignity is eternal. Never let the empty laughter of others prevent you from following your legacy. Your worth is not determined by your clothes or the car you drive, but by the heart you carry. If you were moved by Don Mateo's journey and the incredible change that transformed humiliation into salvation, leave us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories of ordinary people who achieved extraordinary feats. Tell me in the comments, what is the promise, greater than money, that guides your life? One girl's promise changed 2 worlds, and which one will change yours?